Hello Year 10 and welcome to your first revision session on Sign of 4. Today we're going to look at Sherlock Holmes and there's going to be a PowerPoint each week for you to work through until we break up for the summer. If you haven't got a pen and some paper, it's a good idea to go and get some, as you are expected to make notes so that you can complete the tasks that's set at the end of this session. To start off with, we've got a recall quiz. All you need to do is work through the 5 questions and write down your answer. At the end of this PowerPoint, you're going to have a chance to have a look over your answers and see if you want to make any changes before we reveal the answers. Now, what's really important when you start thinking about your literature essays is that you know what these assessment objectives are. So just a quick recap. AO1 is your understanding of the text, your interpretation of the writer's ideas and your use of quotations. AO2 is your analysis of methods, and don't forget methods include language, structure, characters, setting, form and plot and so on. And your AO3 is your context. So your response needs to make sure that you cover each of those assessment objectives, with AO1 really as that driving force. So we're going to have a look at 5 key points for Sherlock Holmes. So our first AO1 statement is that Conan Doyle presents Sherlock Holmes as a man of extremes. And we're going to have a look at how he's introduced by taking drugs. So the quotation is, he thrusts the sharp point home. So initially, we might, as a modern reader, question this drug use and find that it's quite an unusual thing for a detective, or an unusual way for a detective to be introduced to us. But we've got to bear in mind that it was much more socially acceptable in the Victorian era. However, we do understand that he is not a balanced person. If we're going to analyse that quotation in a little bit more detail, we would look at that verb in thrust, because it highlights that urgency, that desperation to have that drug, to have the peace that the drug brings him or the stimulation that the drug brings him. We've also got an interesting metaphor when he says that he thrusts the sharp point home. This could suggest that drug taking provides some comfort for Sherlock Holmes. It could also imply that actually this is a regular occurrence. When we look right at the very end, we've also got a reference to taking drugs as well. The quotation, for me, there still remains a cocaine bottle. So here we've got a circular narrative, which could suggest to us that this character is unlikely to change, but it reinforces this idea that his life revolves around his work. He is obsessed with his work, and when that work is finished, he needs something to fill the void. There are a couple of other quotations at the bottom of the page that also reinforce this. My mind rebels at stagnation. I cannot live without brain work. So again, this reinforces that idea that this is a man of extremes, that if he is not working, then he needs something else to dull his mind or to keep his mind occupied. So he is obsessive. The next point that we're going to make is that Conan Doyle presents Sherlock Holmes as emotionless. And the quotations that we're going to have a look at are that he's a calculating machine and an automaton. Both of these are metaphors, and it suggests really that Conan Doyle is presented as being quite inhuman and devoid of emotion, almost like a robot. He is, as a character, very rational. Remember, he makes his deductions based on evidence rather than emotion, and that, at the moment, really is the key trait of a modern detective. When we're looking at these quotations and we're looking at this idea that Holmes is emotionless, we can't avoid mentioning that Watson is the complete opposite. So Watson is the foil. Watson brings the emotional reaction to the case. And we need that. We need to see as readers that emotional reaction so that we can engage with that story. Just looking a little bit deeper at some of the language analysis, we can look at calculating. This again reinforces this meticulous nature of Holmes. The next point that we're going to look at is that Conan Doyle depicts Sherlock Holmes as a skillful detective. And one of the ways that he depicts him as a skillful detective is that he actually solves the case. Remember that this case is presented to us as readers as being a really difficult case to solve. The fact that he actually solves it really highlights his skill. The quotation that we're going to have a look at is hawk-like features like a trained bloodhound. Now, this animal imagery describes Holmes in a way that makes his detective skills seem natural and instinctive. If we look at hawk-like features, we really need to think about why Conan Doyle chose a hawk to compare Sherlock Holmes to. Now, hawks are birds of prey, and they're also symbolic of good vision. So Conan Doyle could be suggesting that Holmes has these great powers of observation, and that's something that we need to keep in mind. The simile, like a trained bloodhound. Bloodhounds are determined to pick up scent. It's part of their natural ability. So again, we have this inference that Holmes is a naturally good detective. But look at the word trained. This natural skill has been refined even further. So again, it emphasises that high level of skill that Sherlock Holmes has. Our next point is that Conan Doyle portrays Sherlock Holmes as a meticulous, superior character who would perhaps be considered an unconventional detective in the Victorian era. Now, we know that Sherlock Holmes uses very scientific methods. Remember, the Victorian era was the age of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, so there was a thirst for scientific knowledge at the time. We've also got to keep in mind that Conan Doyle was interested in forensic science as well. And we really see that in Sherlock Holmes' method of investigation. The quotation that we're going to have a look at is measuring, comparing, examining. Now, we've got a triple of present participle verbs here. Present participle verbs end in ing, and they highlight how active Holmes was in his investigations. If we compare this to Athelney Jones, who is much more passive, so much more laid back about his investigation, and he bases investigation really on theory and just who is the most likely suspect. These verbs also emphasise the precision that Sherlock Holmes has. He is thoroughly inspecting this evidence in a scientific method, and again, this is in direct contrast or juxtaposition to Athelney Jones. We also need to have a look at this motif of light that we see in the novel in reference to Sherlock Holmes. So we've got glowworm and eyes glistening. Now, we know that the motif of light is seen in the novel when new clues or new light is shed on the case. Here, Holmes sheds light on these challenging situations and is almost portrayed like a saviour, like a god, lit up like a saint. Our last point is that Conan Doyle presents Sherlock Holmes as a character of contrast. He is egotistical about his intelligence, yet is humble about receiving praise for his detective skills in the press. The first quotation that we're going to have a look at is said by Holmes at the start of the novel. He states that he is the only unofficial consulting detective, the last and highest court of appeal in detection. This quotation really demonstrates Holmes' ego. He's boastful about his unique role, and there is certainly that sense of superiority, especially in relation to other detectives and the police force. Conan Doyle needed to portray him as better than other detectives due to the poor reputation of the police. The second quotation that we're going to have a look at is when he states that the work itself is the highest reward. Sherlock Holmes does not seek conventional rewards. His motivation is solving the puzzle, which could make him look humble, but also elevates the quality of his intelligence. Holmes is above phrase. He's above coveting money as reward. I also think it's really interesting that we never find out what Holmes gets from Mary Morstan from solving that case. No mention of money is there at all. So again, it implies that he is above material objects. You also need to make sure that you mention context throughout your essay. So the first point that you might refer to is that Sherlock Holmes is based on a real life person, which is Conan Doyle's university lecturer Joseph Bell. You also need to be aware that Conan Doyle was interested in forensic science, and that's a reason why Sherlock Holmes uses these methods. And we can see these methods in his meticulous investigation of the crime scene, as well as the reference to his in-depth analysis of different types of tobacco ash. Now, we know that the reputation of the police in the Victorian era was very poor, and this is created in direct contrast to Sherlock Holmes. He was very methodical and precise and solved crimes based on evidence, whereas the police were perceived to make arrests based on likely suspects. So anyone that was in the vicinity, anyone that was local, anyone that would have a motive was arrested by the Victorian police rather than basing it on any scientific evidence. An interesting fact is that Conan Doyle was a liberal in his politics. He stood for Parliament twice, so we know that he's got an interest in trying to change the country for the better. This liberal attitude is also seen with Sherlock Holmes' lack of judgment of lower class, and also the fair treatment of those from lower classes too. In order to give a fully rounded response, you must refer to Conan Doyle's intentions with Holmes' character. So, Holmes' character could have been created to criticise the police at the time. Remember, he is created in direct contrast to the police force. It could be to criticise the rise in the class divide, because we see Holmes treats everybody the same. It could be a criticism of the promotion of materialism, because Holmes does not value material reward. He does not seek money. He just seeks the thrill of solving a case of brain work. His character could also have been created to reveal the importance of working together, and not only working together but overcoming differences in order to do this. Watson and Holmes are in complete contrast to each other, but they work well together. It could be to reveal the importance of scientific investigation in order to deliver justice. It could be to reveal the importance of intelligence over reward. Intelligence is really celebrated in this novel, and that's something that you should refer to when you're writing about Sherlock Holmes. It is a celebration of intelligence and scientific investigation. His character is also a celebration of how involving all corners of society in solving problems brings justice. Remember, he calls on the Baker Street irregulars. He calls on Toby's owner in order to help solve the crime. There are no class barriers with Sherlock Holmes. Now, I've also included an extract from an exemplar from an exam response for the question, Holmes is an interesting and unusual investigator. This student gained full marks in the exam, and it's for you to have a look at in your own time, but there are some areas that I just wanted to point out to you. Firstly, they begin their paragraph and the majority of their sentences with Conan Doyle. So this shows that they're addressing the writer's intentions, that they understand that this is a construct. Another area that I want to draw your attention to is their use of tentative language. So they use, probably overuse, perhaps, quite a lot, and could, and so on. And one of the reasons why this is great is because it shows that this student is aware that there are several ways of interpreting a text, and that's something that you need to make sure that you do. So if they're using perhaps, it could suggest that there are many interpretations. They've also developed their interpretations, and there's a detailed analysis as well. It's not enough though just to begin your sentences with Conan Doyle, and that means that you're addressing the writer's intentions. You need to go much further. You need to think about the effect that writer in particular is trying to create and the message that they're sending to the reader. So have a read through this and you can use this to help you with your next task. So this is your task. Holmes is a typical detective. To what extent do you agree with this statement? As a minimum expectation, you need to create one paragraph in response to this question and send it to your class teacher by Friday the 12th of June. If you are struggling, we've got a drop-in clinic at 10 a.m. on Friday the 5th of June with Mrs. Clark, and she'll answer any questions that you may have. So you need to make sure that you include the following in your paragraph: a clear AO1 statement and quotations with analysis, alternative or multiple interpretations, reference to Conan Doyle's intentions, and links to the question. If you are pushing yourself, you should create an essay response to this question and email it to your teacher by Friday the 12th of June. Now, I've not gone through absolutely everything linked to Sherlock Holmes. We've just selected 5 points, so you don't have to use the material that's on the PowerPoint. It can be from your own independent revision. We don't mind. But this response needs to be with your teacher by Friday the 12th of June.